Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, how can I build my own robot? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone, welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week's episode is about building robots as a hobby, with a guest whose fun, step-by-step projects are making robotics, electronics, and 3D printing more accessible for non-experts. But first, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to Robot Talk through your favourite podcast provider to make sure you're the first to hear the latest episodes. Another way to find out about new episodes is the email newsletter, which you can sign up to by going to robottalk.org. So, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce this week's guest. I recently had a great chat with Dan Nicholson from MakerForge about creating open source robotics projects you can do at home. Today, I'm chatting to Daniel Nicholson, founder of MakerForge, a platform aiming to inspire and empower makers, hobbyists, and enthusiasts to explore the world of open source robotics, electronics, and 3D printing. Hi Dan, wonderful to have you on Robot Talk.
Thanks, Claire. How are you?
I'm fantastic, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
So you started out your kind of robotics making journey with a large bipedal companion robot project. So can you tell me a bit about this robot and how you got started?
Yes, I started out with the most complex project I probably could have chosen.
Yeah.
So I'm a software engineer, and I've been a software engineer for about 20 years, but I don't really have any experience in any of the other areas other than kind of tinkering with electronics over the last few years and that kind of thing. But I've always been interested in robotics, and it's always been something that I've been really keen to try. And then obviously during COVID and lockdown, everybody was stuck in their homes. I thought it would be good for me to try and build something in the form of a kind of small desktop companion robot. And I had a Raspberry Pi, I had an Arduino, and I had a little limited knowledge of soldering and those kinds of things. It started out as a cube. So the idea was this cube would rise up off the base and interact with users to a limited degree. And as I got into that project and really got my hands dirty, I realized the limitations of the design. And I wanted to work on something that would be more interesting visually. So the project really evolved from there. And I chose a design before I knew what I couldn't do. So for the people who are listening who don't know, the current design is a bipedal robot. It's powered by USB-C, but also batteries, so it could be mobile. It has two legs with inverted knee joints and hobby servos to animate the legs and the head. The body contains the batteries and an Arduino microcontroller, which is responsible for the servo movement. And then there's a serial connection to the Raspberry Pi, which is in the head, and that's responsible for the higher brain function. So including camera input, voice recognition, audio, neopixels, and cloud connectivity, that kind of thing.
Okay.
The first year was building and testing and experimenting with what works and of course, what didn't work. And as I was doing that, I decided to make it open source. And because I'd learned a lot from YouTube and other areas like that, I decided to set up my own YouTube and Instagram to kind of pay that forward back into the community. And I'm not very good with names. And I thought, well, my name's Dan and I'm making things, sharing them. So I created the channel that's called Dan Makes Things. And then as the project grew legs, it gained quite a following. So people wanting to build their own and add to it. So the project evolved into something that others could build and add to themselves. So I began to focus more on a modular design and an accessible design as well. So for example, there are really three main areas to a project like this. You have the software, you have the 3D prints, and then you have the electronic components as well. For the software, we've created a system where if you don't want to include a specific module, you can disable that via a simple config file, and it will remove all of the dependencies and the need for all of that kind of thing.
Okay.
3D prints are not only accessible, but also designed in a tool that is cloud-based and free to use, at least for public sharing. So that they can modify them and get access to the whole version history of the build, much like you would do with version control and software. And then the electronics components are all things that are easily available or should be easily available. And of course, that completely depends on where the user lives and that kind of thing. So really the key tenet of it was making it so that as many people could build this as possible. And I formed the MakerForge.tech website recently to kind of continue to share that and other projects. And we have now somewhere in the region of 30,000 followers, and I would say dozens of builds around the world. And we're at the stage where we're getting others with specific skills joining to elevate it past the point that I have the capacity or capability to do myself. So proprioception, simulation, general modifications, and improvements. So it's a great time to get involved in something like this because it's big enough that there's a good community interested in the project, but it's small enough that individual contributions are still really valued. So it's been an interesting 4 years, and I'm excited to see, I suppose, what the next 4 years will bring.
Yeah, absolutely. It's lovely that you've kind of been able to cultivate this kind of this community around making where it seems like you're not just sharing information for people to absorb, but you're also kind of, there's some give and take there.
Exactly. Being able to allow them to contribute and to be able to share their enthusiasm for the project is really exciting as well.
Has this somewhat taken over your life? How much time are you spending on robots these days?
So I obviously have a full-time job. This isn't my full-time job. This is something on the side. And I tend to fit it in around other commitments. You know, I have a family, we have pets, we have things that we need to do. So I tend to jump in and do, 10 minutes here and 20 minutes there. And I think the beauty of 3D printing is you can work on a model over the course of a few sessions and then send it to the printer. And it might take 4 hours to print, but then that thing that you had in your head is now in the real world again.
Yeah.
And it's really great to kind of see that sort of thing happen. But yes, it probably does take more time than I realized to get this stuff working.
So what aspect did you find most challenging about getting into robotics as a hobby?
Yeah, so there are so many different areas to learn with robotics, even hobby robotics. But I'd say that that's probably a good thing. And, if you look at it, you've got 3D printing, you've got 3D modeling, you've got electronics, mechanical design, software, and probably 100 other areas. PCB design I got involved with in this project as well. But if you're getting started, you don't necessarily need to learn all of those things at once. It's something that you can pick a project that maybe has the files available already and a guide on how to build it and learn things gradually. And I think I probably did things the hard way because I wanted to build something that didn't exist at all. Piggybacking off concepts of things that other people had done, and then obviously having to learn all of these things in order to make something. I think I had unrealistic expectations about what I could do when I started. But I suppose that was useful in a way because it meant I didn't limit the scope too much.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in terms of challenges, there is a huge gulf between hobby robotics and professional robotics because of cost and accessibility. So the focus of projects has to be slightly different. For example, there are certain motors that you see in some of these more professional projects that can be from, hundreds of pounds each to over £10,000 each. And so cheaper components are generally used in hobby robotics, which limits the scope of the project by that nature.
Yeah.
I think it's good because things are getting easier these days as businesses cater to more the maker market and that kind of thing. And so much has changed, even just since I started. The Raspberry Pi AI-enabled camera has completely changed the direction of the project just in the last few months. Okay. There's now a massive range of microcontrollers that didn't exist when I started, and modular electronics that are targeted towards this kind of thing that just weren't around a few years ago. So it's really great to see all of that starting to happen more and more.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously building a robot is not just about the kind of the technical engineering side. There's also quite a big component of design in there. How would you describe your kind of robotics design style, and what do you draw inspiration from?
I'm not very much of a designer, as people can probably tell from my builds, because they tend to look like boxes with things sticking out of them. I try and draw inspiration, I think, from fictional characters and examples, and I think a lot of people do that. But then because of my limited design skills, I try to lean into the idea of making something realistic rather than trying to imitate that fictional design. So, redesigning a leg so that it will fit actual servos in rather than trying to make it look like the model that you see in a computer game, for example, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm really very much just focused on trying things and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And again, being able to rapidly prototype and iterate designs with 3D printing is a really useful tool for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I get a kind of vaguely Star Wars vibe from some of your projects.
Yes, well, the main project is based on a robot from the video game Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, because at the time that I was looking for ideas, that was released and I started playing that and obviously fell in love with the character. And I think a lot of people in the community are attracted to the design because of that similarity as well.
Yeah. So we had an audience question from Andy on Twitter, who says, how do I find robot classes or clubs for adult enthusiasts? Everything I've been able to find is for kids.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point about clubs. I think the clubs aimed at kids tend to be more visible. There are maker spaces or meetups you can join, but it can be a little harder to find. So I generally either follow accounts that I'm interested in or just kind of keep an eye out for events on various websites that I'm following. Classes are starting to become more common, and you can go on platforms like Udemy and see a lot of different courses that are relevant to the robotics space. And there are other online providers, even things like online diplomas that you're able to do for free. I think I did an online diploma in robotics a few years ago that gave you a good overview of the topic. Or, of course, just YouTube. And that's how I learned, for the most part, that and experimenting. And there are also now really interesting companies where, not mentioning any names, but there is a company that will allow you to learn ROS, which is the robot operating system, but they do it via cloud computing. So you don't have the headache of configuring a machine that can run ROS. And you also get access to their physical robots via the cloud, so you can program them remotely.
That's cool.
And VM, who I've worked with recently, also does a similar thing where you can rent a rover and then you can send your code to the rover and allow it to run on their physical device.
That's amazing. Yeah, really cool. And then we have another audience question from Deep Thinker on Blue Sky, who says, how can we efficiently use 3D printing for home robotics?
That's an interesting one. So I think the benefit of 3D printing is that you can iterate quite quickly, and you need to understand what you're doing, because if you're 3D printing models just for looking at, there are different ways of printing things that work that wouldn't necessarily work for robotics. And I'm thinking in terms of the part will break if you don't align it correctly, so the layer lines don't put stress in the wrong direction. But the good thing about it is because you can print quickly, you have the option to be able to print something, try it out, see what works, see if it fails and see how it fails, and then reprint a new iteration and just continue to build on that. So if anything, it's one of the strongest tools that we have in robotics and rapid prototyping, because it's a little bit like having a superpower in that regard. You can take these things and just quickly build on them. My original version, when I started building, I didn't have a 3D printer and I was building everything out of wood.
Oh my gosh.
And there is no way I would have ended up at this point in the project if I'd had to build everything out of wood in the garage with a drill. Yeah.
I guess it seems like 3D printing is one technology that's really kind of opened up the possibility of home robotics to more people.
Yeah, definitely.
So we then had another audience question. This one was submitted on the website, and they say, I follow several companion bot makers and I love them. Do you think this is something that every household will have in the future, and will they behave like a pet?
It's funny because I've been approached by startups looking to make companion robots, and I'm always curious about the use case and the market demand for that use case. Do people actually want to pay the cost for that thing and how much it costs to manufacture. And I think the thing that makes a robot different from a toy is that it's functional in some meaningful way. Yeah. And with AI becoming more accessible, there are definitely possibilities there. As far as a pet, I don't know. I think there is definitely a market for that kind of thing. I think, again, it just comes down to cost. But I want to see a world where I'm in a retirement home in my 90s and my companion bot is looking after me. Or even better, not needing to be in a retirement home because our personal robots allow us to still be mobile and active for longer. I mean, will that happen in my lifetime? I'd say it's certainly possible from the progress we're making.
Yeah, So I a while back, I won't say the name of it, but I supported a robot project on Kickstarter, and Leo, a little companion robot. That was the idea. And when it arrived, I have to say I was extremely disappointed because it was it was a toy. It wasn't a robot. It didn't really have that much functionality. You know, it said a few phrases. You could interact with it at a really minimal level. I think it's going to be really hard to come up with a companion bot that doesn't lose its novelty value very quickly, even if it can do a bit more than the one I ended up buying. A pet is it has so much more variety of potential to interact with. I feel like we're a way off being able to come up with a companion bot that's actually meaningful in some way.
That's right. And the human-robot interaction element is the key thing here because it needs to feel like a companion or a pet or a friend rather than feeling like something that you have to maintain, a piece of furniture or a tool. That's the difference.
Yeah. Although in terms of the cost, when you look at how much people spend on like pedigree dogs and cats, I reckon if the companion bot was good enough, that people probably would pay the price.
That's true. Oh, there'd definitely be some people who would jump straight on that, and I'd probably be one of them, let's face it. But again, for me, part of this is about the joy of creating something myself and the learning from that process. Yeah. I do have a robot dog that I was sent in the early days of the channel. And other than doing the review, I've never used it because, I don't have any real connection to it. Whereas mine, because I've spent all of this time going into it, I'm constantly thinking of improvements and new features and that kind of thing. So it's a whole different level from my perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I guess maybe if you're, the example you gave was in your later years in a retirement home, perhaps, at that stage in time, something that's comforting and just a bit of companionship might be more important.
Yeah, that's true.
And we have one more audience question. This was also submitted on the website. They say, how does open source software and information affect and influence your builds?
I would say it's absolutely critical because a lot of what I've done is built on open source software and even hardware, standing on the shoulders of giants. That's the reason I made the project open source, so that others can benefit from that model in my work as well. And I'd say I'm constantly amazed by what the open source community can produce. And I really hope that it continues and grows so that we can keep making real progress in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's really something to this. The fact that so many people whose only interest is to genuinely make something work well can kind of come together and iterate back and forth on things. It seems like just a vastly better way of making software and I guess hardware as well than having one big company that just wants to make money out of you.
Exactly, yeah. And that's part of the challenge is we need to make sure that there is a continued building on that existing knowledge and those existing features. And of course, there's so much of that available now, which is really great to see.
Yeah. So what are you excited about for the future of your kind of making journey? What big challenge do you want to take on next?
Do you know, it's really interesting because just on this project, we have about 5 or 6 different directions we can go. One of the big things everybody wants, every time I post a video, the big question is, can it walk? And of course, it's using hobby servos. It doesn't have any kind of idea of where its leg positions are. So we have people who are really keen to see that happen and people with professional robotics experience who are jumping in to kind of start to see that happen. And then just continuing to build on the new technology and add new features and make it so that it's more compact and more reliable and all of those sorts of things. But what's interesting, I think, to me is I'm not just on this one project. I'm working on a few other things in parallel as well that don't maybe resonate as well and a screenshot on Instagram, but things that I'm interested and passionate about doing myself. And it's just great to see that I can go online, I can do some research, I can order some parts, and I can try these things out, all based on like the work that other people have done in different areas and kind of continuing to contribute to that. So yeah, I think the answer is watch this space, because it's going to be an interesting few years kind of continuing to build on this sort of work.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Yeah, when I speak to roboticists, the thing that comes up over and over again is walking is really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And even, especially if it's bipedal, like even the top end humanoids that are being made that are, worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, they still kind of walk a bit like they need the toilet.
Yeah, you see a lot of short videos showing something working really well. What you don't see is the 100 times it didn't work up until that point, and that's the real challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Dan, it's been great speaking to you today. I've been talking to Daniel Nicholson, founder of MakerForge.tech. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, please share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review. It really helps boost the podcast, so thanks in advance. And make sure you check out @Robot Talk Pod on social media to see a photo of the bipedal companion robot that Dan and I talked about. I thought you might like to hear a sneak peek of this month's bonus episode. What do you wish someone had told you when you were first getting started in robotics?
I got into robotics because I thought robotics was fun. I just wanted to build robots that did cool things. And what the cool things were didn't matter. They just had to be cool. So that's how I got into robotics. But then if you go back and tell sort of 20-year-old Pratap that he would now be talking to an agronomist, a marine biologist, a civil engineer, all within the same week, I would not have imagined that.
Yeah.
The fact that robotics is so interdisciplinary, both within engineering and computer science, that you need sort of expertise from all these areas to be able to build robots might be obvious. But the fact that these robots are then going to be used by stakeholders that come from all of these areas sort of wasn't intuitive, wasn't obvious to me. And that's been a great realization where now it's not just like cool robots or robots doing cool things, but they're also sort of doing useful things.
Yeah.
I guess through all my years in robotics, I've come to realize that it is an incredibly welcoming place. Robotics is an area that thrives in interdisciplinary disciplines, right? You can learn a lot about mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or computer science, but you can also, have a deep passion for biology, and you can fit those together.
Yeah.
Or you can have a deep passion for environmental engineering, or really, you name it. Robotics thrives at the intersection of disciplines, and that's immensely powerful, and it makes it much more fun. It's a great field to be in.
If you'd like to hear more from this bonus episode, sign up as a supporter on Patreon by going to patreon.com/Claire Asher, and you'll get access to the full catalogue of bonus content. Next week, I'll be speaking to Catherine Menon from the University of Hertfordshire about designing ethical robots. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.